She was checking her phone, trying to hold her world together, while her daughter clutched a crayon drawing like it was treasure. Then, without her noticing, the girl leaned close to me and whispered a request that left me staring after them long after their car was gone. Maple Street woke up slow, the way small streets do when the sun is still taking its first careful steps over rooftops. Jake rolled the bay door open and felt the familiar draft of cool morning air slide across concrete, stained by a decade of stories. Oil drips like constellations, shoe prints from customers in a hurry, a chalk line where he once measured a drive shaft for a farmer who'd needed to get back to his fields by noon. The sign above the corner lot creaked. Jake's Honest Repairs, blue letters weathered by summers and salt, still stubbornly legible, still his. He liked that it looked a little tired. It told the truth. He did the same things each morning, not because he had to, but because routine put the world in order. Keys on the hook, lights on in a neat row, cup of coffee set on the high stool near the tool chest, where the metal was nicked from 100 small victories. He wiped a clean rag over the counter he'd planed himself and checked the day's work orders he'd penciled in the night before. Nothing extravagant. An oil change, a brake inspection, a stubborn check engine light he suspected was a loose gas cap. Work he could do with his hands and his head. Work that paid the bills without cheating his sleep. Honesty had started as a choice and hardened into a habit. In a business where people arrived already braced for bad news, he'd learned to let his words land gently and his estimates land fairly. Treat people right. Charge what's right. Sleep well. He reminded himself, not because he needed the reminder, but because the rhythm of it settled him like a breath. At 32, he understood that trust moved at its own pace, showing up like sunrise, slow, then all at once. Only after you proved you deserved it. He took a sip and let the aftertaste of cheap diner coffee sit on his tongue. Outside, the street did its quiet choreography. A jogger with bright laces, a delivery truck grumbling past the bakery, an older man walking a small dog who insisted on examining the same patch of grass every day as if it might confess something new. Jake lifted a hand to the man, who nodded back, neighbor to neighbor, keeper to keeper of small routines that make up a life. The shop smelled like it always did, motor oil and hot rubber, a faint sweetness from the coolant shelf, and the sharper scent of brake cleaner that clung to the air like an exclamation point. He liked the way those smells stacked into something that felt like possibility. A car limping in could leave whole. A dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree could go dark again. People came and worried and left relieved, and the distance between those two states was the space where he did his best work. He thought, not for the first time, about the kind of boy who'd grown into this man. There were snapshots he never taped to the wall, but carried anyway. A kitchen table at 7 years old, coins counted into small stacks, a ride home on a bus that coughed each time it shifted gears, a mother's face arranged into reassurance she didn't quite feel. He didn't need those memories to sting to know what they'd built in him. The way he instinctively scanned for ways to help, the way his jaw set whenever he heard the brittle sound of someone pretending they were fine. He checked the radiator hose stock, ran a thumb along the rubber, and slid the bin back with a small clack. He liked knowing what he had and what he needed before the day asked. The pegboard looked like a blueprint. Wrenches in ascending order, ratchets nested like silver fish, hoses coiled, clamps lined like commas. When everything had a place, problems did, too. A breeze slipped under the bay door and stirred the corner where the kids' table sat. 2 sturdy chairs, a stack of coloring books, blunt crayons in a plastic cup with a chipped rim. He'd placed them there on purpose, not as marketing, but as memory insurance. Parents thought better when their kids had something to do. Decisions went softer when small hands were busy creating a world in bright wax lines. He jotted a note to call a parts supplier, just routine, and looked out at the street again, the morning now fully itself. The sign swung once and settled. The light grew warmer along the hood of a sedan parked curbside. Jake tipped back the last of his coffee and felt the day reach for him like a tool he already knew how to hold. Somewhere beyond the bakery truck and the jogger's second lap, an engine labored, just a whisper at first, a thread of sound frayed by distance. He didn't turn right away. He listened. He could tell a lot from a sound. A misfire hiding under a smooth idle, a belt asking for mercy, a coolant system pleading in steam. The whisper thickened into a cough, the cough into a wheeze. He set the cup down on the stool without taking his eyes off the street. Then he heard it clearly, the sound of a struggling engine reaching for help, and felt the day change shape around it. The cough of the engine grew louder until it rounded the corner, black paint catching sunlight in streaks dulled by a thin layer of city dust. A mid-sized SUV coasted unevenly, every rotation of its wheels carrying a kind of apology. Jake stepped closer to the edge of the gravel lot, eyes narrowing. Steam lifted from the seam of the hood, white and restless like morning fog escaping too early. He'd seen that scene more times than he could count, but each time it carried its own kind of urgency, because behind the wheel there was always someone who hadn't planned for this interruption. The vehicle slowed, hesitated, then rolled to a stop just feet from his open bay. Jake wiped his palms on the rag looped through his belt, out of habit more than need, and set off across the lot. His boots crunched over gravel, steady, unhurried, but carrying a kind of reassurance in the rhythm. When he reached the driver's side window, he found himself looking into a face that had already surrendered its morning plans. She was in her late 20s, maybe 30, blonde hair pinned back neatly, but already loosening in the heat rising off the engine. A navy business suit framed her shoulders, its crispness at odds with the tension in her posture. She gripped the wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the day. Her fingers tapped restlessly, not to music, not to thought, just to nerves. Jake noted the tired edges of her eyes, the lines that weren't permanent but came from weeks of not enough sleep. Having some trouble? Jake asked, leaning slightly, so his voice carried through without startling her. He kept the tone easy, the kind that said you're not stranded, not while I'm standing here. The window lowered with a soft hum, and she turned toward him. Relief and frustration blended across her face. I think it's overheating, she said, voice careful, each word pressed flat by the weight of schedules unraveling. I was on my way to drop my daughter off at school, then get to work. This couldn't have happened at a worse time. Jake nodded, not quick, not dismissive, just enough to show he understood. Mind if I take a look? She released the wheel, sighed, and pushed the door open. As she stepped out, Jake noticed how her shoes clicked against the gravel, too polished for this kind of ground. She smoothed her jacket with one hand, eyes darting to her watch as if she could will time to stretch. Behind her, through the tinted rear window, a movement caught his eye, a small face pressed close, peering out with unfiltered curiosity. The back door creaked open, and a girl of about 6 climbed halfway out, sunlight sparking off oversized sunglasses that nearly swallowed her cheeks. She wore a pink dress dotted with tiny white flowers and a matching bow tugging her blonde hair into place. The glasses slipped, and she shoved them up with a practiced motion that made her look like a miniature movie star impatient with paparazzi. Her gaze locked on Jake with the kind of intensity only children carried. Open, measuring, unguarded. Hi there, Jake said, softening his voice, crouching slightly to meet her eyes through the window frame. What's your name? Emma, she announced, as if the world needed to know it. Then, tilting her head, are you going to fix our car? I'm going to try my best, Jake promised, glancing toward the woman who was now standing beside the SUV, her hand protective on the doorframe. I'm Jake, by the way. Sarah, she replied quickly, distracted, still checking her watch. Her expression shifted, practicality taking over. Listen, I really appreciate this, but I need to know how much it's going to cost. I'm a single mom and money's been. She stopped, shook her head slightly. Well, it's been tight lately. The admission wasn't casual. Jake saw how her jaw tightened after she said it, like she regretted opening that much to a stranger. He recognized that reflex. He'd seen it on his own mother years ago when she tried to mask struggle behind politeness. He gave no sign of judgment, only nodded once more and turned toward the hood. He unlatched it, the click echoing louder than expected, and lifted the panel with practiced ease. Heat breathed out against his face, carrying the acrid sweetness of leaking coolant. He leaned in, scanning. The problem declared itself almost instantly. A radiator hose split near the clamp, green liquid glistening where it shouldn't. A simple fix, maybe 20 minutes of work. But when he straightened, wiping his hands on the rag, his gaze drifted back to Sarah and Emma. The way the girl now leaned against her mother's side, small fingers wrapped around larger ones, as if the whole morning depended on that single grip. Jake didn't say anything yet. He just took in the picture, the steaming hood, the worried mother, the hopeful child. He remembered being 7, waiting while his mom counted coins in a mechanic's office, pretending not to notice the sigh in her shoulders. This moment, he thought, had already stopped being just another repair. Jake let the hood settle into its locked position, the metal clang carrying across the lot. He turned back towards Sarah and Emma, wiping his palms again on the rag, as if the motion could soften the weight of what he needed to say. "The good news is it's not serious," he began, careful with his tone. Too much relief might sound patronizing, too little might sound like indifference. "Looks like a split radiator hose. I can have you back on the road in about 20 minutes. Sarah's shoulders dropped visibly, the kind of sag that comes when tension releases faster than dignity can hide it. For a moment, she seemed lighter, but then her eyes darted to Emma, then to her watch, then back to Jake, and the weight returned. "How much?" she asked, sharper this time, as though bracing for impact. Jake studied her for a beat. He could see it in her, the math running silently in her head, the way she pressed her lips together as if already deciding what bill could go unpaid to make room for this one. He recognized the instinct too well. Emma shifted closer to her mother, tugging lightly at her hand. "It's okay, Mommy." He said it's not serious. Jake crouched so he was eye level with Emma. The bow in her hair leaned slightly to one side, and her sunglasses now perched like a crown on her head. "She's right," he said gently. "Not serious at all. Your car will be good as new before you know it." Emma nodded, satisfied, and leaned into her mother's leg, her small arms wrapping around Sarah's thigh like an anchor. Sarah exhaled. I don't want to get stuck owing more than I can cover right now. I've had a lot of unexpected, life lately." Her eyes flicked to Emma, and the unfinished words filled themselves in. Jake straightened slowly, the rag still in his hands, twisting once between his fingers. He remembered being on the other side of this conversation, watching his mother fight to keep composure while explaining why she couldn't afford a routine repair. He remembered the shame that didn't belong to her, but stuck anyway, the kind a child couldn't unsee. "You know what?" Jake said, surprising even himself with the sudden certainty in his voice. "Don't worry about it. I'll fix it, no charge." Sarah blinked, confusion crossing her features before indignation rose to cover it. "I can't let you do that. You have a business to run. And part of running a good business," Jake replied, steady but not defensive, "is helping neighbors when they need it. This'll only take a few minutes. Why don't you and Emma wait inside? There's coffee, and I keep some coloring books by the desk." Sarah hesitated. Pride and gratitude wrestled visibly across her expression. Finally, she nodded once, sharply, as if granting herself permission. "Thank you," she said, quieter than before, the word carrying more weight than its syllables could hold. Emma brightened immediately. "Do you have purple crayons?" she asked, hope sparkling behind her oversized glasses. Jake grinned. "Plenty of purple." The little girl squeezed her mother's hand and tugged her gently toward the shop entrance. Sarah followed, pausing once to glance back at Jake. For the first time since the SUV pulled in, her eyes softened. Not yet trust, but the beginning of it. Jake watched them step into the shade of the shop, the door clicking shut behind them. He turned back toward the SUV, rolled his shoulders, and drew in a steadying breath. This wasn't just a repair anymore. It was a reminder, and those had a way of lingering. Jake propped the hood fully open and leaned over the engine bay, the metal still radiating heat against his forearms. He traced the cracked hose with a practiced hand, running a finger along the split where coolant had seeped and dried in uneven streaks. It was a simple enough fix, one he could do almost blindfolded, but simplicity didn't change the picture he'd just seen. A mother standing at the edge of her limits, a child clutching her hand like ballast against the storm. The hiss of the cooling system filled the silence, but behind it he could hear Emma's voice from inside the shop. Hi, unfiltered, carrying through the half-open door. She was chattering about crayons, about which colors were best for drawing flowers, her words spilling over each other like water from a tap left running. Sarah's quieter voice answered occasionally, edged with distraction but softened by love. Jake smiled faintly. The sound carried him back decades. He could see his own mother bent over the kitchen table, stacks of coins spread like puzzle pieces between her hands. He'd sat nearby, scribbling shapes in pencil on notebook paper, pretending not to notice the way she paused over each stack, as though deciding whether rent was more important than food or whether the car could last one more week without repairs. He had learned then that worry had a sound, thin, clipped, not always in the words but in the space between them. He'd heard that sound in Sarah's voice outside. Jake tightened the clamp on the replacement hose, secured it, then poured coolant slowly into the reservoir, watching the liquid settle. He worked with steady hands, but his mind kept circling back to Sarah's insistence that she couldn't accept a free repair. He respected that. He liked people who stood tall, even under strain. But he also knew the line between dignity and desperation was a fragile one. As he checked the seals and wiped down the last of the residue, he muttered to himself, "It's not about money today." He didn't realize he'd spoken aloud until the words hung in the air, faint but final. He closed the hood with a careful push, the latch catching cleanly. For a moment, he just stood there, rag still in hand, looking at the SUV as though it were more than a machine. Sometimes a car was the difference between making it and breaking down, not just on the road, but in life. He wiped his hands thoroughly, tossed the rag onto the workbench, and made his decision firm in his chest. Sarah wouldn't pay for this. Not today. Not here. Jake glanced toward the shop windows where Emma's small figure leaned over the counter, crayons spread before her like treasure. Sarah sat beside her, phone in one hand, the other reaching to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. They looked, for a moment, like a scene from a life Jake hadn't thought about in years. A life with routine, with small joys, with someone else to share the weight. He stepped toward the door, ready to deliver the news again if he had to. He knew she would resist, pride usually did, but he also knew he had something firmer than pride on his side, understanding. This wasn't just an offer. It was a promise to himself that when the universe handed him a chance to make someone else's road easier, he wouldn't flinch. Jake set his tools neatly on the workbench, each socket clicking into place, each wrench laid down with care. The repair was almost too easy, the kind of job that would normally blur into the hundreds before it, forgotten by dinner time. Yet today it felt different. Every turn of the ratchet, every careful check of the hose clamps carried a weight beyond the metal in his hands. Through the open shop door, Emma's voice floated out like music from a far-off radio. She was telling Sarah about the drawing she'd started, something about a sun with extra sparkles, and a house with a roof shaped like a heart. Jake couldn't make out every word, but the rhythm of her chatter filled the shop more warmly than the morning light streaming through the windows. Children's voices, he thought, had a way of sanding down the rough edges of silence. He caught Sarah's reply, soft and measured, though her tone carried the fatigue of someone who had learned to balance encouragement with practicality. "That's lovely, sweetheart," she said, a smile tucked beneath her words. Jake pictured her leaning closer, trying to hold on to the moment despite the rush of the day pressing in from outside. He tightened the new hose, tested the line pressure, and poured coolant until the reservoir brimmed green and steady. His hands worked from muscle memory, but his mind wasn't on the engine anymore. It was back in another garage, years ago, when he was a boy watching his mother barter with a mechanic twice her size. She had stood straighter than she felt, insisting on paying what she could, refusing charity even when her voice trembled. He'd stood behind her, clutching the straps of his backpack, and sworn silently that someday, when he was the man on the other side of that counter, he'd do it differently. And here it was, a woman holding herself together with pride, a daughter sitting close enough to feel it, and him, the man with the tools in his hand and the power to choose. He leaned back against the SUV, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. The shop smelled like fresh coolant now, sharp and chemical, overlaying the deeper scent of grease and rubber. He listened again. Emma was asking endless questions. Why the crayons broke if you pressed too hard? Why coffee smelled grown-up? Why cars made smoke when they were tired? Jake smiled without realizing. Children carried wonder like it was their birthright, unbothered by the weight adults learned too soon. He closed the hood gently and stood for a moment in the quiet that followed. His reflection stared faintly back from the SUV's windshield. A man with rough hands, oil at the corners of his nails, lines etched deeper than 32 years should allow. Yet behind him, through the glass, he could see Emma's little head bent over her drawing, Sarah's profile angled down as she listened. It felt, absurdly, like looking into a life he hadn't known he missed. Jake took a long breath and let it settle. The repair was done, but something else had begun to shift inside him, something that had nothing to do with cars. Jake wiped his hands one last time and stepped into the shop, the doors swinging shut behind him with a soft click. The scent of coffee lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the waxy sweetness of crayons. At the small table near the counter, Emma sat perched on the edge of her chair, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she colored with deliberate strokes. Sarah leaned over her shoulder, her phone resting on the counter but ignored for the moment, her focus captured entirely by her daughter. Jake hesitated a step inside, struck by the intimacy of the scene. For a moment, it wasn't a customer waiting on her car. It was simply a mother and child sharing a pocket of time, a pause in the chaos. He cleared his throat lightly. Emma's head snapped up, her face lit with the eagerness of a child who had been waiting to show off her masterpiece. She held the paper aloft, nearly smudging the corner with her still crayon-dusted fingers. "Look, it's us," she announced. Sarah smiled, brushing her daughter's hair back with a gentle sweep. "That's beautiful, sweetheart." Her voice softened, warm in a way that chased away the earlier sharpness Jake had heard when she worried about money. Jake stepped closer, curious. The drawing was simple but bold, thick strokes of green for grass, a blocky blue rectangle for the car, and three stick figures standing side by side. Emma had drawn herself in pink, Sarah in navy, and next to them, a taller figure in brown with dark smudges for hair. The man stood smiling by the car, larger than the others, almost protective. Emma tapped the crayon tip against the page. "That's you, Mommy. And that's me. And that's the nice man who fixed our car." Jake froze for a fraction of a second, his throat catching. He hadn't expected to see himself there, not in the bright certainty of a child's imagination. He forced a smile, lowering his voice so it came out steady. "That's a great drawing, Emma. You're quite the artist." Sarah glanced at Jake, caught somewhere between embarrassment and gratitude. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than before, soft but guarded, then shifted back to her daughter. Jake cleared his throat again, trying to steady the moment. "All set," he said, gesturing toward the door. "Your car should run fine now. Hoses replaced, coolant topped off. No more overheating." Sarah reached for her purse almost immediately. "Please, let me pay you something." Jake shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. But I do have one request." Her brows lifted, cautious. "What's that?" "If you ever need any car work done, you bring it here first." "Deal." The corner of Sarah's mouth curved into what might have been her first genuine smile of the morning, small but unmistakably real. "Deal." Emma grinned too, clutching her paper close to her chest as if the agreement had sealed more than just a promise about future car repairs. Jake looked at the pair of them, mother and daughter, still framed by crayons and coffee cups, and felt something in his chest shift, loosening in a way he hadn't expected when the SUV first pulled in. Emma clutched her drawing with both hands as Sarah gathered her phone and purse from the counter. The little girl's energy seemed to hum against the quiet of the shop, her gaze flicking between her mother and Jake as though she were carrying something too important to keep in. Jake crouched down so he could meet her eyes. "Thanks for showing me your picture," he said, his voice warm. "That's one of the best cars I've ever seen drawn." Emma giggled, but instead of stepping back, she tugged lightly at the hem of his work shirt. Her small fingers held on until he leaned closer. Her face had shifted into seriousness, the kind of gravity only children could muster when they were about to share something they believed to be world-changing. "Thank you for fixing our car," she whispered, her eyes darting briefly toward her mother, who was still busy slipping her phone into her bag. Emma hesitated, then cupped her tiny hands around Jake's ear. "Can I tell you a secret?" Jake smiled, leaning in so her breath brushed against his cheek. "Of course. She's my mom," Emma whispered, as if revealing something sacred. Then, after glancing again at Sarah, she leaned even closer, her voice almost inaudible. "Please marry her." Jake's heart stopped in its rhythm. For a moment, he couldn't move. The words hung in the space between them, heavier than the steam that had risen from the SUV, sharper than the hiss of the coolant line. He pulled back slightly, searching Emma's face for a sign of jest, but her expression was earnest, her small head nodding as if she had solved the world's greatest problem. He looked up at Sarah instinctively. She hadn't noticed. She was busy checking her phone, thumb moving in a quick scroll, unaware of the secret her daughter had just released into the air. Jake swallowed, feeling the weight of it press against his chest in a way no wrench or socket ever had. Emma straightened, satisfied, and clutched her drawing to her chest again. She gave him a conspiratorial smile, as though the matter was settled. "Emma, sweetie, we need to go," Sarah called, finally slipping the strap of her purse over her shoulder. Jake rose slowly, still stunned, his mind reeling. He had fixed engines, rebuilt transmissions, welded frames, but nothing had prepared him for a child's simple, unfiltered hope. Emma skipped ahead toward the door, but Sarah lingered a step behind. She turned to Jake, her voice quieter than before. "I can't tell you how much this means to me. People like you, well, they're rare these days." Jake forced a small smile, though his voice sounded strange in his own ears. "Just paying it forward." Sarah nodded, her gaze steady for a heartbeat longer before she turned to follow her daughter. Emma waved enthusiastically from the back seat once they were inside the SUV. Jake lifted his hand in return, holding it there even after the vehicle rolled away and disappeared around the corner. Her whispered words echoed in his mind. "Please marry her." The street grew quiet again once the SUV disappeared, the faint hum of its engine fading into the distance. Jake stood motionless for a long moment, hands still half raised as though the little girl's wave had tethered him in place. He lowered it slowly, fingers brushing against the side of his work jeans, and exhaled. He turned back toward the shop, the morning sun now higher, sharpening the edges of the bay door, lighting up the dust motes floating in the air. Everything looked the same. His tools on the bench, the rag draped over the stool, the faint smell of coolant still lingering. Yet he felt different, as if the simple act of fixing a hose had opened a door he hadn't even realized was shut. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Oil changes, a brake inspection, small talk with familiar customers. He worked steadily, but his mind kept slipping back to the look on Sarah's face when relief softened her features, and to the weight of Emma's whisper brushing against his ear. He carried those moments with him like loose bolts in his pocket, impossible to ignore, pressing against him with every step. By the time the sun had set and the last car had pulled away, the shop was quiet once more. Jake rolled down the bay door with a rattle, the lock clicking into place. He moved through his routine. Lights off, keys hooked, floor swept. But each action carried a new layer of thought. He stepped outside and let the evening air wash over him. The sky had darkened into indigo, and the first stars blinked into view, tentative and small. He leaned against the doorframe, rag slung over his shoulder, and looked upward. The stars reminded him of the nights he'd spent as a boy on the porch, listening to his mother talk about tomorrow, as if it were a friend you could trust to show up. Back then, tomorrow had felt uncertain, fragile. Tonight, it felt like a promise. Emma's voice replayed again in his memory, soft, sincere, carrying the weight of a wish too big for her small frame. "Please marry her." He chuckled under his breath, though the sound came out more like a sigh. Children had a way of cutting through the noise, saying what adults were too guarded to admit. Jake straightened, pulled the rag from his shoulder, and tucked it into his back pocket. He locked the front door and stood at the edge of the lot for a moment, watching the quiet street. Tomorrow would bring new cars, new problems to solve. But tonight carried something different. The reminder that kindness wasn't small, that sometimes the simplest repair could shift the course of a life, not just for the person receiving it, but for the one offering it. He tilted his head back once more, catching the steady glow of the stars. A smile, genuine and unforced, spread across his face. For the first time in years, he felt the quiet pull of possibility, like the road ahead wasn't just about engines and repairs, but about connection, about what could grow from moments you never planned for. Sometimes, he realized, the best things in life started with the smallest acts of kindness. And sometimes, just sometimes, little girls knew exactly what they were talking about.